Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be back with you again tonight. Tonight we're meeting with Karen-Atkinson, and Karen has written a book, a good book, an excellent book. Can you see the name of this book? It says, Get Your Shit Together. I think that's what it says. There's an asterisk there. This covers pretty much everything this course covers, and in pretty good depth. Hi, Karen. Welcome. Glad you're with us.
Thank you.
Let's go back to the beginning. Where were you born?
San Diego, California.
Have you ever been out of California? Yeah, I saw you in Chicago a few weeks ago. So you're a native Californian, huh?
I'm a native Californian, but I've been a lot of other places, just not lived other places.
Excellent. Are you an artist?
Yes.
Do you make art weekly?
Yes.
Did you think you were going to be an artist when you were a tyke?
Possibly.
When did you know?
Probably around age 16.
What did you study in college? Where did you go to college?
I went to school wherever I could find a job.
So did you go to more than one?
Yes. And but I did go to graduate school at CalArts.
At CalArts, and now you are where?
I teach at CalArts.
Did you do anything between Did you graduate from CalArts, or are you still enrolled?
No. I graduated from CalArts in 1984. It took me 10 years to get through school.
Okay.
And then 5 years later, they asked me to come teach for one semester. And I'm still there after 26 years.
I'm
not sure if I've graduated.
Oh, presumably. How does teaching affect art making?
My art making, or just in general?
You.
I would say teaching is really interesting, especially when you have international students.
Okay.
And what's really interesting to me is that teaching is one way to share ideas, but it's also one way to learn ideas.
Sure.
And I think there's a really interesting notion about being with younger people all the time, because I know all the slang. And
yep.
It's easy. It's a really interesting thing because I'm challenged constantly by all my students, which range in age from straight out of high school up until their 60s.
So you're teaching undergraduate and graduate both?
Yes.
Are you teaching predominantly professional practices courses?
Half my time is professional practice, and the other half is a newly formed ceramics class.
Okay. Do you think your art making would be different were you not teaching?
Yes, I think so. Although I started my current practice based on starting and running a nonprofit organization. So I've done so many things as an artist that they kind of all get lumped together.
Okay. I mean, I'm perpetually intrigued by the notion of whether graduate school makes sense. And I have a vacillating opinion. And I wonder, my current thinking is, how does it affect, one's art making production? I was talking to some artists who teach, and, their teaching has a lot to do with research, and they get the research to be done frequently by their students, so it facilitates some of their art creation. Whereas with others, I've seen it happen that teaching art enables or forces them to deal with various aesthetic issues that get in the way of their own art creation. I can see, and I'm sure there's, a bunch of other different ways that it can impact on somebody's art making. I'm not clear on these, going to art school and being an art school teacher. I'm not sure that I have an unequivocal answer that, yeah, do it this way.
Well, what I would say is that going to graduate school, you can learn almost anything in the world by yourself, but it takes a heck of a lot longer when you're thrown into a situation with a whole bunch of other artists and other faculty who are incredibly interesting, I think that you'll learn things really, really fast. Not only about your own art practice, but about how other artists think, how other artists think in other cultures. And so it gives you a huge, well-rounded element of things to think about. And I think that that's different if you go to a local regional school versus going to a school that's national and international. But I think that you can pretty much catch up and learn things really fast no matter where you go. My big issue now is the cost of what it takes to go to art school. And up until recently, I'd always told people to just forget about money, because money's just money, and go to a place that will be really good for you and your practice. But I'm finding it harder and harder to say that anymore because of the cost of what it takes to be a graduate student. So I counsel a lot of artists, and one of the things that I ask them is what their dreams are, what they want to get out of a graduate program, and then basically assess whether they actually need to go to graduate school or should go to graduate school, or maybe they should just do it on their own.
Fair enough. Let's shift gears a little bit. How long have you been teaching professional practices?
I've been teaching it officially at CalArts for about 12 years, but I've been teaching it in the city of LA for over 20.
And when you started 20 years ago, you were the only person in the known world covering this material?
That I knew of. I since found out there was one other person on the East Coast doing the same thing. And between the two of us, I think we're the oldest ongoing professional practices teachers in the country.
Why do you suppose that art schools, and I mean, I feel like art schools are only getting to covering this material in the last 2 years. I've been covering it for 4 years. You've been doing it obviously longer. I felt pretty much like when I began 4 years ago, I was essentially the only person doing it, though others gave lip service to it but weren't really covering it. Why are art schools so late to addressing what you and I both think is a significant need?
Well, what's interesting is that the Tremaine Foundation, the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, actually did a survey and called just about every school in the country and asked them about that about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And most of the university's responses was, we don't need that, or we're not going to teach our students that. And I think the reason why most colleges are way behind in that is that they think that somehow professional practices, and this is what I've heard from people, actually teaches you how to be a commercial artist, which I find the most bizarre thing I've ever heard of. Because actually teaching professional practices is a way for artists to understand how the art world works, whatever art world they're in. There's so many different ways to be an artist these days. And I think that without that knowledge, it's scary for artists. So if they graduate from school and get picked up by a gallery, they don't know how anything works. And I got tired of watching artists getting screwed right and left and not being able to have a practice because one thing or another would get in the way. And I kept finding them getting into trouble. And when I started a nonprofit arts organization, I started working with artists individually, because they would do things like submit a proposal to the gallery that was so awful that they didn't even know how to do a basic proposal. So what's interesting to me is that schools are finally changing. When I started working on this and when I started trying to teach it at CalArts, it was kind of a battle. And I think it's still a battle, actually. And the information that I provide runs the gamut from very specific things that you need to know as an artist, like dealing with galleries and curators and all of those, but also business practices and basic things that artists need to know. Like, for instance, artists are always bartering and trading, but they don't know what the IRS laws are about that. Or, you know, there's so many different things that can actually help an artist out. So I was doing a lecture the other day and someone said, oh my God, I can actually write my own press release? Like, people just, you know, don't understand that sort of basic working element. So I think schools are actually really resistant for a number of reasons, but I think that's finally changing. And I think the way it's changing is that incoming students are starting to ask, are you teaching this kind of material when they go to apply to graduate school? And so I think that the artists out there are changing it faster than anybody.
Do you think this is a material that belongs in graduate schools and not undergraduate, or belongs in both? How do you break it down?
I actually teach it in both. There's not everybody, especially because school is so expensive, is going to go to graduate school either right away or maybe ever. And I think that undergrads sometimes are just as interesting as graduate students, and they really need to know this information as well.
Are you covering different material pre and postgraduate?
Not a lot. I talk about it differently, and there's a little bit more discussion in the MFA class than there is in the undergrad class, and because some of them have, you know, exhibition experience, or they've been out and about doing things for a while, and so they can kind of talk about it. Whereas in the undergrads, I find that most of them don't have much outside experience, and so it's a little bit different. But the information that I provide is exactly the same.
Are there other people teaching the same material at CalArts?
There are now. The other schools are starting to teach this. There's somebody in the dance program teaching it. There's somebody in the music program and the theater program. So yeah, it's starting. It's the president decided that all schools should offer something after I started my class.
Visual arts, it's solely you?
Visual arts, it's just me.
Does everybody who goes through school take the class?
No, and it's not required. And it's an it's an elective. And I used to have, when I first started teaching it, I had over 40 people in my class all the time.
Right.
And it's interesting, that's dropped off a lot.
Oh,
and
weird.
I'm finding out that there's a number of students who aren't taking it while they're at CalArts. One, because they don't think they need it. And two, because they know they can take it when they graduate, because I also teach it in the city of Los Angeles.
But that doesn't mean they take it once they graduate.
What was that?
It doesn't mean they take it once they graduate. It means they can. They procrastinate forever.
Yes. Some of them come by after about 3 years and decide that they really need to find out what they didn't find out. And the ones that do take it are actually doing really, really well.
I mean, since you're totally objective, wouldn't you argue that this class is the most important thing they can take as part of their college curriculum?
That's usually what my evaluations say. But, you know, the artists can be funny. A lot of them think they don't need to know information. They think they already know it. And only when they get out there do they find out that they don't know much of anything.
I tend not to think it's artists. I tend to think it's just humans, or probably anything.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think about artists because those are the ones that I'm working with.
Right. I mean, most of the people who take this course are between 30 and 80, and they realize that there's holes in their knowledge. I kind of designed the course for those who were still in art school, and those weren't the people who ended up signing up. And fortunately, I could, you know, shift everything I was doing pretty instantaneously and make that, you know, necessary transition. You know, and then I try to wonder about other schools and to what extent they teach, you know, professional practices and so on. I mean, I relate it somehow, I don't know why, art making I relate to bricklaying, but I'm not convinced that most bricklayers know how to balance a budget or, you know, do any of those kinds of comparable skills. Do you think about that? What other, I mean, like, you know, a business degree kind of teaches you some of these things, but usually at such a higher level that you don't get the basic stuff. I mean, who else is teaching people how to create a living, have a career?
Well, there's actually the Tremaine Foundation, which I mentioned before, started out with funding 6 colleges or art schools and 6 nonprofit organizations. And they've grown that program every year and dropped off the first people and added. I think that they probably have about 40 schools that are now teaching it in the system on a regular basis. So they've really made a huge dent in the way that professional practice is both seen in the world and also in providing the resources needed to teach that. Because I started teaching so long ago, I couldn't find a book that I liked. All I could find was kind of touchy-feely things or, you know, I got a gallery and so can you. And I didn't really want to use that book for my own teaching, which is why I ended up downloading my brain and writing my own book so that it would be a much more comprehensive resource. Because most of the stuff that I find out there is, okay, once you get a gallery, then you're fine. Well, I know that's not true.
Yeah, same thing once you get married, you're fine. I mean, we all know that works.
Yeah, right. People come around, you know, sooner or later, but it would be nice if more artists knew how things work, because I think that you know, artists have never really owned the means to their own production. And I think a lot of artists think that, oh, I just need a gallery and then I'll be fine because the gallery takes care of me. The problem is we know that's not necessarily true. And
right.
What happens if a gallery closes? Or what happens if, you know, something goes wrong? Or, you know, there's so many things that can happen that if you're not prepared, you can find yourself in deep trouble. Like if you don't keep track of your own records, if a gallery closes, you may never see your records ever again.
Totally true. And, you know, we've dealt with that in this course with, well, we met with Todd Chilton, who was represented really beautifully by Hudson and Feature. You know, and Hudson died suddenly, and Todd is down to one gallery instead of two, and I'm not so certain what the one gallery's commitment is, which raises the question, how many galleries should an artist have?
I don't know. I mean, I think that it's interesting because I don't have a gallery and I'm not interested in a gallery.
Okay.
So I think that you don't have to have one, depending on the kind of work that you're making. But I think that I think it depends on your practice. If you're making a kind of work that fits in a really kind of specific gallery and there's not that many of them around, one might be fine. But if, you know, generally these days, most artists have a gallery in either Los Angeles and New York and Europe and perhaps somewhere else. So I think it depends on how good your first or your primary gallery is.
Kind of, but in the interest of diversification and not having too many eggs in one basket, I think 3 would be a minimum, and 5 wouldn't be too many. You know,
it might be. Yeah, I know that there's, you know, I think it depends on how well your dealer works with other galleries as well.
Yes. It can be hard. And we did a webinar years ago with Mark Kostabi, and Mark was talking about how artists should have as many galleries as galleries have artists. And he was talking about having different, you know, I mean, Mark is an exception, but you should have, you know, a different gallery for different media, you know, like a gallery for your drawings, a gallery for your prints, a gallery for your paintings, and then more than one gallery in different, you know, that's in one city. And then, you know, in another city you should have, you know, multiples of galleries again. What do you find are the biggest misconceptions artists have? I mean, I guess we're getting down to basics. I mean, I guess the first one is that, Jesus, shit, I have to have some business acumen.
Well, that's actually one of the first things that happens.
Yeah.
So I think that ideally artists should, one, know how things work. I think that artists should be smarter than their dealers or the curators or anybody else they work with. So if you know all that information, then you can actually function as a professional. I think the biggest misconception that artists have is that people are going to take care of them and do things for them. And I get emails all the time of artists always looking for somebody else to do everything for them. And I find this a really interesting element. And I think that, you know, for one, there's some artists that, of course, will never be good at business. But there's other artists who are fantastic. And it doesn't really take that much work. So I think it really depends on the kind of artist that you are in terms of you know, the information that you really need to have. I think that if you know how things work and you know how to avoid pitfalls, you're going to have a much better life as an artist. And I find that artists who really know what they're doing and can ask really important questions, if either the dealer or the museum or the curator or any of those partnerships that artists form, work on a much better level, because both of them actually know what's expected from the partnership. So if you're talking to a dealer, you know what you're supposed to do, and the dealer knows what they're supposed to do, and you have some sort of agreement, and you don't get into trouble. It's the same with any other partnership that you work at, and I try to get artists to think of, you know, funders as partners, curators as partners, dealers as partners, those kinds of things, so that you're thinking about it on a very professional partnership level instead of, well, what can you give me or what can you do for me as an artist?
Totally true. When you said, I want to explore the partners thing more, you said funders as partners, and I can run with that, but I want you to. Go ahead. What do you mean?
Okay. I think that, well, for instance, if you're an artist and you're doing a project and you're looking for some funding support, often there's different sort of foundations and people who fund artists who have a particular goal in mind. So if you look up funding, for instance, and you find out what that funder is interested in, they may be interested in a whole lot of different topics. So if one of the topics that the funder's interested in is what your project is, then it makes sense to apply for a grant from them. So funders have the money and artists have the ideas. So if the funder puts up money for the artist and the artist executes something that the funder is interested in accomplishing, then it's a true partnership. Now, there's different kinds of elements of where, like, maybe a funder gives a fellowship and there's not that much, there's less kind of partnership-ness going on. But I think that the more those collaborations happen, the more good things happen. So, for instance, I've partnered with all kinds of different businesses to try to do something that wasn't possible without them. So, for instance, I had a project once where I took 20 parking meters and wired them for sound and put them in sites all over Los Angeles. It was a public art project. And you can't go to the corner market or the corner art supply store and buy a parking meter. So I had to get them donated from the only company in the U.S. that actually makes parking meters. And it was my one shot. So I basically had to create a partnership with that company in order for them to basically donate those parking meters to me.
Okay. Let's take this a step further.
Okay.
Have you entertained the notion of artists having business partners?
Business partners in terms of, somebody who collaborates and works with them?
Yes.
Or, yes, actually that happens a lot. I think that is a good situation if they can find somebody good. One of my fears is that there are so many people now calling themselves an art agent, and they put a shingle out saying that they're going to do all these great things for artists and charge them a lot of money. But I'm finding a lot of these people don't know any more than the artists that they're collaborating with.
Oh, hell, they know a lot less.
So that's not a good kind of business partnership. I think that there's other, though, good business partnerships. I think if you have a really great gallery relationship, that's a great business partnership. But you can also have a business partnership without being represented. So there's all kinds of people who sort of collaborate, especially couples, right? The wife does the business part for the husband who's the artist, or various different situations like that. But I think that, until now, it was hard to get the right kind of information to actually be a business partner. Because where did you find that out?
What about the notion of an artist having an advisory board?
I lost you.
Yeah, and then I lost you. I asked what, and I think we're both back. What about the notion of an artist having an advisory board?
Actually, I think that's a really great idea. I recommend that to artists all the time, to have advisors and people they can talk to, people that they can meet with, people that they can ask questions about, like a sort of a mentorship in a way, or a direct partnership, depending on what the relationship is between the two artists.
Have you done much advising people on actually setting this up? I'm trying to, and I haven't gotten official on it yet. But I see the notion of having 2 advisory boards, one of which, well, the second of which is a pay-to-play, where you're mostly going after people who need their soul cleansed, and the artist is providing, the cleansing as well as a look behind the curtain, and that costs, a certain amount of money per quarter or per month, and it's usually for a, maybe a 2-year term. And the second advisory board would be like a financial person, an accountant, people who are providing services gratis but are not making a donation. Perhaps a party planner, a financial advisor, things like that. A graphic designer where you can actually use that person's services. And most of this I've gotten from Colleen Keegan, who works with Creative Capital, and I think Colleen's got some really good thinking. And I've worked with some artists who are setting these kinds of things up. I sense a fair amount of reluctance on most artists to take the initiative to create these things. I suspect because they feel like they're not worthy. And, there's a self-anointed lack of worthiness, which I think all humans tend to be born with, but some of us fake it better. Have you dealt with this kind of advisory board?
Yeah, when I meet with artists individually, one of the things that I do is really try to suss out the things that they don't know, or the things that they really need to work on. And sometimes I'll recommend that they talk to various people. Sometimes I'll recommend an ongoing mentor, but sometimes I'll just recommend and say, look, make sure that when you go to an accountant, it's an arts accountant, because so many artists have lost their shirt because they had a regular accountant that didn't know their art laws or something like that. But I'm always encouraging them to meet with people as much as possible. And I do think a lot of them say to me, well, why would they talk to me, right? They have that sort of sense of, nobody wants to talk to me, right? But I find that people really, really helpful. And when I call people and want to talk about something, I'm often asking them, about their opinions or their advice, or just having an interesting conversation with them. And I think a lot of people are willing to do that. I think if you make it...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just said, I think that if you make it official, and it's sort of like, I think about an advisory board as like a nonprofit organization runs.
Right.
And, if you basically, I know a number of artists that have asked people to be an advisor for them. And that only means that the person has agreed that they can receive a phone call periodically or have a chat with them periodically. It doesn't mean that they can sort of call them up every day and sort of harangue them. But I think if you can set up some parameters, it's a really great way to proceed. I meet with artists all the time, and not usually on a really ongoing basis, but I'll meet with artists, suss out what I think they need, get them started, and then kind of check back in with them. But often they kind of solve the problem, and they find somebody that's really useful for them, and it works great.
Do you meet with artists as part of your business? I mean, do you charge outside of school to meet with artists and advise them?
Yeah, but a lot of times I'll do it for a cup of coffee or a cocktail. And then sometimes I'll charge them. That's usually the first meeting. And after that, I usually charge them, a small fee per hour. But I'm pretty bad at not charging at the cocktail hour.
I bet. Yeah. It's easy to give it away for nothing,
Yeah, well, I won't do it forever.
She says. We'll see. How about you in your studio practice? Do you have assistants in your studio?
I actually run Getting Your Shit Together as an art practice.
Okay.
So I am not really making objects right now, but I have written a couple of books, and I design software for artists to use to keep track of everything in their art life. I also run a radio program called Just Radio. We call it a casual radio station because we broadcast the music like it. And so I have all these support services for artists. So I hire artists, and I only hire artists to work for GIST, or has a collaborative kind of element. And we're always working on different projects and, you know, different elements. So right now I have an artist who's working on a new website. I have someone else who's doing some market research and editing the teaching manual that's the companion to the artist manual. So I have about 4 or 5 artists working with me on a fairly regular basis, all part-time and all independent contractors. So I'm basically teaching them how to run a business, and then they kind of move on and I get somebody else. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm training artists to run their own businesses.
What, chronologically from the present going backwards, what have you changed your mind about?
In terms of what? That's a big question.
Artists, art practices.
Artists.
You know, I mean, for example, we were doing a webinar with Jason Middlebrook, and the question came up about focusing on one body of work at a time, and I said yes, and Jason said, Paul, that is so last century. Jason's 46. I've known him since he was 6, so, you know, there's a familiarity that renders some truth.
I never work on the same thing at one time. I mean, I never just work on one thing. I'm always working on multiple things. So, you know, besides running GIST as an art practice, I do have other things that I'm doing. So I'm always multitasking and always getting ready for some project that I'm doing, as well as also teaching full-time and running a business full-time.
Yeah, but where I want to go is, how has your art practice changed over time, or what ideas are now being embraced or adopted that you and I used to go, oh, no, never. And now we go, oh, yes, always. Or, oh, yes, most of the time.
I think I'm one of those artists who's always kind of pushed the envelope and never been at the right place at the right time. I started doing social practices back in the 70s, and it wasn't a thing that the art world understood or knew about. So I also started a nonprofit organization, and everybody told me that, oh my God, that's going to ruin your whole art career. It might have. Ran it for 10 years and gave it to the next generation. I know that when I was running a nonprofit, I still was doing an awful lot of exhibitions and shows. And one of the things that changed is I found myself in a wheelchair for 6 months because of a ruptured disc, and I could no longer make giant installation projects. And so I turned to the computer, which is an interesting thing, because I think that what I do now would not be happening if I hadn't had that intense time where I was forced to do something different, where I couldn't sort of lift things and move things. I had to sit in a chair. So I learned the computer incredibly well and started making a lot of work that way. And so I think that, and most of my practice, like I said, I'm not represented, so I don't really make objects. I do large public installation projects. Sometimes I make objects. But right now I'm in a residency at a restaurant run by artists called Thank You for Coming. And one of the things I'm going to be doing is creating social dinnerware. So I tend to jump from one thing to another because I find it so bloody interesting, instead of things that I think I'm supposed to do in order to sort of get somewhere in the art world. So, you know, for all I know, I'm just spinning my wheels all the time, but I find it so much more interesting than doing something that someone else thinks I should do. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not represented, is because I was represented for about a minute, and it wasn't a good relationship. I got a museum show, and she said, oh, no, we have an exclusive. You can't show in a museum. So I ran like hell.
And you did the museum show?
Yes.
Yes. Cool. Let me ask you another question. But you guys, if you have questions, raise your hands, and we will get to the questions momentarily. I mean, the going about of getting a public commission being unrepresented is not all that different than being represented. often, because of many public commissions, it comes through the artist's effort and not through the gallery's effort. Agreed?
Yeah, I think a lot of my projects have been self-initiated. They're not commissioned, which makes it even more complicated. So I tend to do the projects myself and raise the money myself, as opposed to doing something that someone else has done and me stepping in.
I hear you. No, that is more interesting and challenging, and you got to find the money. How much of the time is chasing the money?
Well, I think in my head, it's all the time, because I think like a nonprofit.
Okay.
So every time I'm doing anything, I'm constantly thinking of how to do it cheaper or how to get it done for free. And when I meet with artists, people tease me all the time because I come up with about 100,000 ideas and, you know, explain different ways to do things. And I think that, you know, chasing the money is something that's fairly constant, but it's also something that I think, like, for instance, I don't write grants all the time. If I come up with something that I find, you know, that I really need to do, then I'll write some grants, or I'll start contacting businesses, or I'll set up a fiscal sponsor and try to get things donated. So I do things kind of on an ongoing basis all the time, because I'm always working.
I get that.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
No, that's good. Keith, hold on a sec. All right, I've unmuted you. Keith, go ahead.
How you doing? Thanks a lot for spending time with us. I've got two questions. One is for you, and the other one is a reaction to something that Paul said, and I don't know if we want to talk about it tonight or later. Could you talk a bit more about advisory boards and give us some examples of some of the best advisory boards that you know of, especially for mid-career artists? And then, Paul, you said that doing art is kind of like bricklaying. I love the idea. I think that that's really interesting. I don't know where that idea could take us. I think this is the first time you've brought it up in the course, and we may not want to talk about it now, but I want to come back to it at some point. Thanks.
I don't know why I said it. Uh-oh. All right, Karen, you go first. Good luck with what Keith asked you. What are examples of advisory boards?
I think that there's a couple of things that artists usually always need. One is financial issues. There are so many laws on the books about how things operate. I think it's really important to have an accountant that actually understands the arts. I've watched people really get into trouble. I think another one is an advisor for somebody who really has a practice that's like where you want to be. So, for instance, if you're interested in the gallery, then finding somebody who's been doing it for a long time can actually be really useful, or somebody who's successful. It doesn't have to be somebody famous, but somebody who's actually had pretty good success with something like that. If you're interested in public art, find a public artist, somebody who, you know, has a number of projects under their belt. If it's somebody like, you know, like me, who's doing things that are off the wall and a little bit crazy, you have to look really hard to find somebody, but you can talk to me. I think that just assessing the things that you think are beyond your scope is how you build an advisory board. It's a lot like this, as a director of a nonprofit, I looked at all the people around me and all the people that were a part of the organization, and we would brainstorm about what are the things that we don't have. And we might say, well, we really could use some legal advice. And so, you know, that might be somebody who you go after as an advisor. Someone else might be, well, you know, how do I write a grant? Or how do I raise money? There's so many different ways to raise money besides writing grants that actually giving yourself that information can be really useful. So once you have all the kind of basic information, the idea is to find mentors or advisors that are doing those things that you still haven't grasped or that you absolutely hate doing. That's another thing that might be useful in terms of hiring somebody. This wouldn't necessarily be an advisor, but I think that you have to sort of balance out If you do have income, that might be something really great. You know, I know an artist who the most important thing to her is to have someone come clean her house, because that's the one thing she hates and she needs studio time. And she's incredibly busy. So I think it's a balance. It's sort of like, you know, what are the things that you aspire to? What kind of practice do you want? And finding like-minded people to have a conversation with.
I've extrapolated from the idea of an artist having a business partner. And the business partner, I think, has probably a 49% interest in the artist's career, and the artist has a 51% interest. And I use those percentages so that the artist is still in charge of their own career and not 50-50, or they can't get outvoted on their career by an advisor. But I've known an advisor who said, you know, Mr. Artist, you write fairly well. Why don't you write a screenplay? I think we could get it produced. You know, and then having that end up into be a series of 3 plays, you know, about the artist's work, which has then traveled. Or, Mr. Artist, you have always done books for your bodies of work, but mostly the books should be fancier and a different format because we can get them onto more coffee tables and we can do greater publishing if you do it that way. So extrapolating from having a single business advisor on payroll, you would have, you know, so it's clearly differentiated from being a studio assistant or, you know, something less than that. You could have an advisory board, and the notion of the advisory board tends to break down into 2 advisory boards. One where you're getting specific services, some of the things that Karen's talking about, you know, like a party planner and public relations and someone to handle your investments and an accountant, those kinds of functions. And because they're on the advisory board, you contact them and ask for specific advice, and they're not charging you. They're not charging you. That advisory board probably never meets as a board. And, you know, you contact them individually. That is usually or often in conjunction. I don't know that, there's enough people doing this to say often, but this is in conjunction with a second advisory board where you have people with a lot of money who don't do a lot of good things or not enough good things with their money, and you're giving them some kind of absolution equivalent to them going to confession if they happen to have been raised in lieu of being raised as Catholics. Or that, you know, they get to see behind the curtain, a la the Wizard of Oz, that you are some sort of mystery, and by sending them a handwritten note with a stamp monthly, thanking them for how much they're doing, and a phone call that explains what their money is facilitating, you know, is something that a number of people would be glad to do. Now, the complications get involved with many people don't need to have this be a write-off, but some do, and you probably want a fiduciary agent who processes the money instead of going as far as Karen did and setting up a 501c3, but you could do that. And also whether these people meet together or not. There's a woman that I've been working with who has her advisory board that she calls a smorgasbord, and they come for lunch once a month, and you know, they get paid by her fixing the smorgasbord, the food. You know, and she has a museum curator on the board that doesn't work in an aesthetic that's like hers, but you know, getting museum input about how things are done is really valuable. And I think an accountant and, you know, I don't know, other people whose creativity she respects. I don't think this should be someone on your advisory board who is a spouse, nor do I think it should be someone who's your best friend, nor do I think it should be someone who is someone you don't know at all. It's, you know, I think acquaintances are the right kinds of categories. Maybe sometime we'll discuss this further. I would like some more questions, and I see one more hand, I think. Nope. Yep. If you guys have more questions, let's go. They don't have to be advisory boards at all. Valerie. Go ahead, Valerie.
Okay, sure. I got a question for Karen. Hi, Karen. I've heard you speak before, and yeah, and how you empower artists is just really amazing to me. I've heard you talk about a concept that you call hybrid careers, and I like the name of it. And when I first heard you talk about it, it helped me start thinking in kind of new, out-of-the-box ways. And, for example, I think that in art school, in the academic setting, it's like we don't discuss business. And then, so ways that artists can learn how to think like an entrepreneur. And I'd just like to hear some thoughts about this.
Okay. So for those of you who are interested, since I don't have a ton of time here, I do have a TED Talk on the idea of a hybrid career for artists. And one of the things that I've been doing is, since I've been working with artists and been a working artist for so long, I've been kind of researching and finding out, you know, different ways to be an artist. And I knew that myself that I wanted to do projects that practically no one thought that I could accomplish, and so I would have to do them myself. So I had to come up with strategies to kind of make things work. And I think that there's so many ways to be an artist these days that I think it's imperative for artists to really think about what is it that they really want. I think most artists, when you ask them if they're incredibly young, say, well, I want a gallery and I want to be famous. That might be fine. There's much easier ways to be famous than being an artist. I can tell you that right off the bat. But I think that there's a lot of artists now that are really starting to think about the relationship between their own practice and their, quote, day job or money-earning strategies. And because it's very, very difficult to be an artist full-time and to make a living, I mean, even famous artists don't necessarily make a living off of their practice. So a lot of artists I know are getting jobs as, you know, a waiter or doing something they absolutely hated. And I started really kind of trying to rethink the ways that artists work. So to me, I divided into two categories. One was the vertical artist, which I call the sort of traditional linear trajectory, where you graduate from art school, you move up the ladder, you know, get a gallery, you get another gallery, you get a better gallery, you move up to the museum, you know, essentially. And it's a ladder situation, and there's only so many galleries in the art world and so many slots for artists. So if you're climbing up the ladder, someone's falling off. But there's another notion of what I call the horizontal artist, which is artists who actually are working in different ways. They might be working in community, they might be actually making kind of site-specific or socially engaged projects or things like that, but they're not necessarily trying to sell their work in a sense. And I'm really interested in the kind of hybridity between the two. I don't think you necessarily have to be one kind of artist or another. I think you can actually shift back and forth. But one of the things that's happening now is that a number of my students are coming up with really great ideas for how to support their practice with an earned income strategy that actually supports their practice, and that their artwork actually supports their earned income strategy. So an example of this would be, there was a student of mine who was a tattoo artist. And so when she graduated, she moved to San Diego and she opened her own tattoo parlor. And by day, she tattoos on other people, but she, as an artist, really pushes the nature of what a traditional tattoo is. For her art practice, she tattoos on people without ink, and they're called ephemeral tattoos. And they show up, but they don't ever stay permanent, and there's no ink involved. And then she photographs them, and that's her art practice. So her day job is supporting her art practice in terms of ideas, and her art practice is supporting her day job. There's other artists that have found jobs or careers that have something to do with the work that they're interested in. So another artist was really interested in electricity, and all her work was about electricity. And she graduated, she signed up for as an electrician's apprentice, which one, makes good money, and two, gave her all the free supplies she would ever need, and she learned as much stuff as she needed. So I think there's different ways to really think about what sustains you as a person, not just as an artist. And I think sometimes that sort of collaborative element of how you go about something can be incredibly useful. So the idea of hybridity to me is about really not putting all your eggs in sort of like one place and just assuming that that's the way it works, but creating something in your life so that so it's sustainable and that you're kind of having a career on your own terms. I think a lot of artists decide that there's only one way to be an artist, and they get frustrated if they don't, quote, make it. I think there's lots of different ways to make it. And that's one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, is artists really thinking outside of that linear trajectory or the ladder, and thinking about the ways that the work that they make is fulfilling to themselves, and that they actually create a life that's really interesting, because you can try to go by somebody else's rules all the time and be absolutely miserable. And I don't think that's probably the best way to go. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you.
Good.
TED Talk for more of that.
Ruth, your turn. Go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if you've worked as an independent curator. I was wondering if you could talk about how you've worked with artists in that capacity.
Okay. It depends on what I'm curating. Generally, what I do is that there's a couple of different ways that curators work, and one of them is the kind of shopping model, where they go to different studios and they say, I'll pick one of those and one of those and two of those, and et cetera. I tend to curate in a way in which I come up with an idea, and sometimes it has to do with my own practice, but I come up with a group of artists that I think are making work that either is similar to the topic or the idea, or I think would be really good as a challenge. And often I ask them to make work for a show. So I'm not usually that sort of shopping kind where I just, go out and just pick stuff up. I'm usually doing it on a little bit of a collaborative basis. And I find that the work is so much better because instead of me trying to force the work into a context, the artists are actually creating the work for a context. And I find that the relationship between the artwork and the room is really, really more interesting. So I tend to work on that model. So if I'm doing something like, I once did a project where I asked artists to make work in slide form and then projected it in a commercial theater in between the popcorn and trivia slides in commercial theaters, which is another huge project. And what was interesting is that the artists themselves, really took into consideration the context of the theater, who the audience was, how they were watching it. It was great because they would make a 2 by 2 inch image and it would show up as 30 feet across, which was really fun. It's still my favorite way to see artwork, is to sit in a theater eating popcorn in a big cushy chair. But the nature of the way that I curate tends to be a little bit more investigative and a little bit riskier than that sort of shopping model. I also don't just ask my friends. I think it's really, really important that curators don't just ask the people that they know, and that they really think about the nature of the show and how that's going to work. I often have gotten a solo show and added a whole bunch of artists to the show as in a capacity of that, which actually freaks curators out a little bit. But often I'll ask them to contribute something to my solo show. And that's another interesting way to kind of have a curatorial element where instead of it just being my voice as a solo show, I bring in artists who have a say. And some of them might be contradictory to my own ideas, but I find that more interesting. So it's a little bit different. But I think curating still is the best curators situations are partnerships. You're talking to the artist and the artist is talking to you, and some really interesting things happen.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. Monica. Hi, Monica. Good luck this week. Go ahead, Monica.
Much. Hi. I'm almost forgetting my question and writing down all my notes here. let's see. Oh, well, actually, I was just going to say I teach at the University of Connecticut in the School of Fine Arts, Art and Art History Department. And we are definitely talking a lot about introducing professional practices class. And we happen to have, you know, like many departments, a large design program and a large illustration program and a photography program. And the illustration and the design people are, you know, do sort of the best at these special practices classes. But we're trying to envision them for, you know, the art students. And I guess I am curious, you know, partly because of what you just talked about, the hybrid, that there are so many different ways of being an artist. You know, how do you structure a course, especially for Bachelor of Fine Arts students who, you know, whose talents are diverse and, you know, you hardly know where they're going to end up. It just boggles my mind to think about how, you know, what is there a standard thing that they should have? You know, given how vague the outcomes are.
What I did is I actually wrote a book for artists, but I also wrote a teaching manual. So that helps artists teach those classes. Because what I found is that most artists know the art world from their point of view, but they don't necessarily know the art world from the curator's point of view, the director's point of view, the gallery's point of view, all of those things. And I've done so many oddball things that I tend to know all sides of the art fence. So if you don't know all sides of the art fence, it's even doubly more difficult. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote a book that has tons of information in it. And I'm in the process of editing the second version of the teaching manual, which should be out in a couple of weeks, I hope. And what I've done is I've included not only all the readings and the information, but the rubrics and, you know, all the great assignments that I've used over the last 20 years, discussion, homework, all kinds of things. And when I teach my class, I mean, at CalArts, everybody, there's no department at CalArts, so everybody does everything together. So it's incredibly diverse. And what I find is that I tend to give them the bits and pieces that are necessary for every single artist. And then I allow them to sort of extrapolate and say, how would you use this? So the first thing I ask all of them to do is define what they want to do for the rest of their lives. So I ask them to write their own obituary. And it's interesting because it forces them to really consider what they want. Not what they think they want, but what do they really want? And then pretty soon it becomes easy to tell them what the details are. And, you know, most of the stuff that we teach is applicable for an artist, whether they're a gallery-based artist or an independent artist or a social practice artist. So, you know, just basic accounting things, how to get money, how to fundraise without writing grants, bartering and trading laws, you know, legal issues for artists. All those things apply to almost every single artist. So there's not a whole lot of things that I teach that aren't applicable. So when I talk about galleries, it means that they know about them, whether they're going to actually use them or not. That's not, you know, that doesn't really matter, but they understand how the process works. And they understand the gatekeeper system of the art world. So basically, I'm pretty interested in either they're going to negotiate with the gatekeeper or they're going to learn to go around the gatekeeper. And I think that those strategies that they learn, those basics, gives them a way to almost negotiate anything that they're doing no matter what. So it's kind of like all the blocks and the pieces, and you put them together according to your own practice. Does that help? Oh, I can't hear you.
Get your manual.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I wrote it for people like you.
There it is.
Can we order it online?
Yes, you can. The new, I recommend you wait for the new version, which should be out probably, I think, in a couple weeks, a month at the latest, because I've rewritten it from the ground up because so much has changed in 5 years.
Okay. So just on your website, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Thank you, Monica. We're running short on time. Margot, go ahead, Margot.
Karen, I'm so grateful for your open-minded approach to a career in the arts, and it kind of helps me to open my mind a little bit more about new approaches to projects. And it just confirms the fact that, you know, we have had a happy existence here in southeast Idaho, remote land that it is. I have to tell you, our daughter is a Cal Arson, and or was graduated from Cal Arts.
I know her.
Oh, you do?
I recognize the last name.
Oh, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. Well, I have this project that I have been dreaming of for so many years, and could I call you for your advice and just see if you think it's too crazy, or I think I have a good project, but I'm totally lost as to how to make it happen.
Well, I'm pretty good at that stuff.
And I have to say, and I don't know if this happens to others, but sometimes the sound cuts out on this WebEx, and sometimes I completely miss a statement, which really frustrates me. But how would I find your website? And
Actually,
I do plan to do it.
you can, it's at www.gyst-ink.com.
Okay.
And if you type "getting your shit together," you'll pretty much, it comes up right away.
Okay.
But GIST is the way that it's the shortcut for getting your shit together. So you pronounce it GIST.
Oh.
You know, you like to get the gist of it?
Yeah, got it. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I would love to talk to you.
I appreciate that very much, and
Okay.
I look forward to it.
Thanks. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
That was cool. All right, I just put the link up in the chat box. Bob, what is Bob? Go ahead, Bob.
You were talking, listening to your whole discussion about the various roles that advisors can play and so on. What I feel that as a mid-career artist, what I really need is a coach, you know, an artist coach. I haven't heard that word yet come out in this discussion, but to me, that's what makes the most sense. You know, guides and pushes and points the way. But one thing I'm particularly interested in your view on is residencies. Do you think residencies can be a powerful thing for an artist to do to sort of build their reputation or their brand or their people's awareness of them and their work? Do you see residencies as a good strategy or tactic?
I don't know if residencies are so good for branding or something like that, but they're absolutely amazing, powerful experiences just for you as an artist in your work. When you go to a residency, you meet people that you'll probably know for the rest of your life. Projects come out of them, collaborations come out of them, intense knowledge of how other artists think. I think residencies are really, really smart things to do. In terms of sort of like helping your career, it's a way of networking. I think that the best thing you can do for a career is network. In other words, meeting people and, making sure people know who you are and what you're doing. It's sort of like getting out of the studio and going to openings and going to lectures and finding like-minded people. I think that also finding other artists that are similar to the kinds of things that you're doing is really, really important. So in a residency, not necessarily will those artists all be making something maybe similar to you, but every residency is different. They range from, a trailer in the desert with nothing to a kind of Club Med situation. And priced accordingly, of course. But I think residencies are so useful because of anything that jumpstarts your creativeness in terms of making work and gets you working. That's the first thing we all have to do is make the work. And, the more kind of jazzed you are about what you're doing and the more interest that you have and the more that you share those things and learn how people respond to your work, I think the better artists you're going to be. So it may not be necessarily, you know, an official career move, but I think because of the networking situations, it's vital. So anything that you can do in that way is useful.
Thanks. And you mentioned earlier about your curating, and I went to your Pinterest page, and I was pleased to see myself on it. So, anyway.
Yay!
All right, let's take one more question from Sherry, and then we'll be done with the questions. Bob, I want to say one thing, though, about, you talked about coaching. You know, I think the difference between a coach and a mentor is really subtle. I'm not sure I grasp it. I work with TED Fellows, and I think I'm a mentor, but I might be a coach. And according to TED, one of them is for a finite period of time for a specific project, and the other one is more infinite and involve life lessons. But I can't tell, I don't know which one's which. You know, and everybody in this course gets an hour-long studio visit / strategy session that we can cover some of that stuff in, and that obviously can be any time between now and forever. This is part of Paul's immortality program. If I put it off, I'll be immortal. Or if I get you to put it off, I'll be immortal.
Better hang in there for a while.
Yes, indeed. I got lots of people who are waiting for those. But, you know, me, clearly, I intend to teach you guys how to fish. I don't want to do the fishing for you. I want you to be able to survive on your own. But there are people out there that we meet with, and I'm glad to give you names of people who will bait your hook for you. I kind of feel like working with coaches is better in the short term and not as good in the long term. I think in the short term, it can help you get a gallery, but you need to know what a gallery is looking for, and you need to be the one that nurtures the gallery relationship instead of having it being done through an intermediary. So that the intermediary may facilitate the relationship happening, but the relationship going somewhere and you using that as a means of getting museum shows and bigger gallery relationships, I think is up to you. So that the better you know how to fish, I think the better off you're going to be. But, you know, I'm willing to help you find what it is you think you need. All right, Sherry gets the last question. Go ahead, Sherry.
Hi, Karen. I appreciate your knowledge. My question is just a quick one. Earlier, you said that you teach professional practices in Los Angeles. Is that outside of Cal Arts, or did you mean
No,
Cal Arts?
I teach it outside of Cal Arts, in the community, and I basically find different sites every time I teach the workshop. So I rotate between nonprofit organizations or someone's studio or something like that, and it's always an 8-week workshop.
Okay, I can find that on your website.
Sherry, you're breaking up some. Did you have another question, or is that it?
Well, I just said, can I find that on your website?
I'm sure you can.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Karen wouldn't be half as good as we think if I wasn't there.
So I actually want to answer the coach question.
Okay.
I think actually as much stuff as you can do yourself as an artist makes you look better and is actually better for you, for your career. But on the other hand, there's a difference between somebody who's an advisor and someone who is actually a coach. And I think about coaches as people that kick your ass. So it could be that maybe instead of having a coach kick your ass, it could be that you just need to check in with yourself periodically. And one of the things I highly suggest is that every single kind of corporation, office, collection of people have staff meetings all the time. And I think that maybe if you have a staff meeting with yourself once a week and look at your career, look at the things that you need to do, you know, make a list of things that are really important and start a priority list. And I recommend that you take one night a week to do the business of art. So it could be that maybe your studio time is on the weekends or whatever, but one night a week in which there's not much going on, maybe a Monday night, is the night which you actually attend to those things. Maybe it's something as simple as updating your mailing list, or looking up galleries, or finding out what's going on in town, or, you know, archiving your artwork, or, you know, scanning your images or whatever. I think that if you meet with yourself once a week and you look at what you didn't do last week and you put those priorities back up, then you're operating just like a coach would. But you're doing it yourself and you're making your own decisions, and you're not necessarily being forced to sort of do something in a way that is prescribed or that someone thinks is the only way to operate. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you.
I think that's a good idea. I think everything you've said is a good idea. I think all of it agrees with me, too.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was simple. All right, this hour flew by. I think this has been really good and really informative. I appreciate, I really appreciate your book. I really appreciate you doing this course. I really appreciate your accessibility and availability and getting this information out there. I think it's, it's really necessary. There are other good books, but I think this one hits more nails on more heads. I'm really pleased and proud that you participated. Karen, thank you very, very much for being with us tonight.
You're quite welcome, and thanks, everybody.
I've unmuted everybody. You guys can all say thank you to Karen also.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. All right.
All right, we have